on this computer. All right, so the title I put was Metamechanics for the metagame. Metagame being the topic that we've been approaching, the metagame of games, which probably needs maybe another name, but that's it for now. But then that connected to what we did last time, and there's what was called kind of flight, of being able to kind of position yourself over the whatever the context, and create this sort of perspectives, like almost like a bird on a flight, that you're able to fly essentially anywhere. And how do they connect? Like, okay, like in a way, like if we visit this sort of basic topics, I mean, the paradigms now has too much text, but if I list them on kind of in the style of voice, we have, of course, like the basics of XORG, which are this sort of the approach of roles, approach of scenes, approach of filters and offers and tokens. In a way, like looking at this sort of paradigms chapter, you could say all of these are rules in the way that the rules are being defined or described in this paradigms part, like in this sort of wider sense of what rules are, which I think was needed. That this was, at least for me, like kind of mental thing that was needed, that like you can position the rules anywhere, but also you can say everything is rules. But if you just say everything is rules, just that word, it almost becomes too limiting in a sense. So that was for me necessary to kind of have the sense of, if we would think of all of these things as rule-like, that what kind of definition of a rule that would need. But that's kind of how I'm looking at these things now. Like, is that like XORG is kind of a set of rules essentially, but rules in the sense that we talked a couple of weeks ago. But going back to this flight, so on one sense, you can say that the flight is kind of a like intentional contrast with mapping and maps, the paradigm of maps. That I would say that the map, which is a useful paradigm. And when I say contrast, I'm not saying like this is better than that, but they serve different purposes. That the map is that it has its aim towards representation of a certain kind of whole, whereas what this so-called flight was, it was more towards capability of positioning, and through that creating perspectives. So when you create a map, it's often like, well, you can have many maps, but the map is often kind of like something that is quite persistent and has a sense of a whole of something. But if you're thinking more in the sense that I can at any point move to a different position and therefore see different things, it's a different emphasis, and I think it's useful to make that contrast, because like the purposes they serve are different. So that was behind the idea of flight. But if you look at this XORG elements, this was a notion I wanted to just entertain. Another approach, or another way of saying this flight, could be filters. It's like saying the same thing, but with a very different metaphor. Like now, it's not so much about flight, but it's like whatever you put creates a filter towards something. But then, if you think about it, a filter is also a capability of creating perspectives, and it's very much like any filter you create can create perspectives towards it. So in a way, you could say that approaching filters in this fashion, or including that kind of approach in filters, is maybe a way to include that part. But maybe even that can potentially create new thoughts about it. Like I'm not the person who is looking for one descriptor only. Like I think it's useful to have many, but so in this sense, like thinking about flight in one sense and thinking about filters is possible. But I would kind of first propose this question to you. If you think about what we were doing, let me go back to it's a big screen. So particularly here, where we're working with these perspectives towards the flight and creating these first ones, which were picking this sort of perspective and adding some description last time. Can you think of these as filters? And if you think of them as filters, does it change things? Does it work?
I mean, you can definitely make it work, I believe. Maybe some of them are less evident than others, but all of the explorations are fruitful, right?
Mm.
Using hairstyles as proto shapes, I think that's a filter we used
Mm.
last time, if we think of it,
Yeah.
to extract certain facts about the hair, for example.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I guess that was a filter in itself, so that is an easy one. But thinking of, for example, the pursuit of poetic games as a filter, you could have it as a layer on top of something else. Like we could go over things again with that as a filter, and maybe new mechanics would emerge. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, like not necessarily diving too much, not repeating the process, but let's say entertaining the thought at least. We can then decide what to do with it. But um, I think it's a kind of an like generally I agree with how you characterize it. The one like interesting thought is like I can take say the pursuit of poetic genes or uh, infrastructure, a gallery showing multiple visual images as filters. But it's slightly a weird thought when there is nothing yet there, or there's just filters. I actually think it's probably more our limitation of how we think of how things that filter behave. That's a whole kind of worms in itself. It's about like human thinking and how filteric it's in its nature. That because there's never nothing. That's the key thing. Like that's but not to open this whole how does the mind work kind of can uh, just to make that notion that why even just putting a filter is generative. It's because there's never nothing. There's always something in your mind, and that's why the filter can work even in that kind of situation. Um, but like otherwise, like these things that are perspectives are can also be thought as filters. But like it wasn't the main topic. I just wanted to kind of entertain like this thought of what did we actually do and how um, how to kind of like generalize that particular approach and this kind of visiting it from other topics like the topic of a filter might be useful for that generalization. That's but what about others? Like if you kind of visit the exercise last time at the start of it and think about it as kind of taking filters and adding filters in. Does it make sense? Oh, by the way, Lida is on a train, so this is probably going to happen several times. So internet connection going on and off. Jakub, does it make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I was just like thinking or reflecting on when I say or when you say filter, what is actually like my implied or like pre-conscious conceptual metaphor for what filter actually represents. Like, yeah, no, because filter can, I can, even when I say that we are using this as a filter, so I was just like reflecting what kind of filter it is, because yeah, I guess there's like various kinds or modalities of what we can call filter, and how it like augments the signals. Yeah, anyway, so I was just like mulling over this thought, which is not very clearly articulated.
No, that's fine. That's actually kind of like the area I was thinking as well. Like it's also, of course, a visit towards what the filter is. But yeah, I'm like, one of the reasons I wanted to introduce that is because if you think like, okay, like we towards this sort of outside representations, and maybe also kind of figuring out the things that we're doing, we were looking at these paradigms. But if we now look at this sort of compositions, maybe even these sort of instruments at the same time, and think about or revisit like what's there to crystallize, like or is there something to reconfigure towards like taking them into outside forms. I have one I don't know, maybe a reconception or a slight tuning of the elements in OBOK that I wanted to open to you, and maybe see if it is seems workable. So if you think in terms of I think if we start from the easiest, like I think the role is fairly sensible in its current structure, like in the current sense of it, in this sense of like almost like an area of capabilities, a space of capabilities, and then the ability to take that space of capability, perhaps even for a moment. And because it's a space of capabilities, it's highly expressive. Like it can be made conventionally, like a I don't know, a graphic designer or whatever, but it can be made in any other fashion, like the impressionist, or we did the combiner earlier, etc. But that in itself, I think, is fairly well positioned. Let's put it that way. But if you think in combination with that, there's let's take the offers. So for me, like when I think of the offers, and also in connection with them rights, there is this. First of all, both offers and rights are inherently relational. Like that, the nature of the offer is to offer a relation. Like even if it's a momentary relation, it's a type of relation. Certainly, is that it's saying, if it's saying like you can get this coffee cup for €3, that is a relation that takes place. So, and then a right is a relation as well, because right is, if you say have a right to vote or make a proposal, that is a relation to a particular scope, particular placement, particular organization. Which I think, by the way, right always is. If there's a right, there's always a scope where it takes place. But so, okay, they're both relational. They also both play with potential in relation with actual. And what I mean by this is, if I have a right to make a proposal, it's something that is defined as a potentiality. I don't have to be making the proposal right now. It's something that I'm carrying. And it's also present as a system awareness. So the scope, say an organization, is aware on some level that I have the right to make a proposal, and it's potential for it as well. But it's true of offers as well. They are also in this sense of potential. Like if I make an offer, like you could get a coffee cup for €3, that's potential. I don't have to be using it right now, but I know it's possible. And the one who is making this offer, say a cafe, is also aware that it's making this potential available. So there is, like, what I'm saying with this, that there is a clear overlap with what the offers are and what the rights are, but they're also different in nature. The one key difference I would highlight is that if the offer, if the right is agent perspective, it's like potentials from the perspective of actor, the one who can operate, kind of thing. The offer is potential from a kind of organizational system end of things, that it establishes a system of itself, that can and usually is a part of some larger system, like buying a coffee cup is a system itself that is part of a larger system organization of the cafe. But does it make sense for you to think about it in the sense that there's like a emphasis on the different end? Like if I have a right, it's more about this sort of actor agent side of definition of potential and channels of potential, whereas if it's an offer, it's more about the side of the organization and the scope where rights can take place, a kind of definition of potential. Is that a sensible thought?
It is, definitely. To me, it makes a lot of sense to focus on relations. Sort of, it feels like a shift in focus from, if you think of a graph, from the nodes to the edges, and
Yes.
how it
Yeah.
is the edges that puts the nodes into context.
Yeah.
And there is also like emphasis on potentiality, so direction. Maybe it's like the edges are vectors that
Yeah.
point towards certain directions. Maybe there's multiple velocities on each one. No, if there's multiple potentials, it can point towards. But that sort of, for one side, and I think Jacob would have some comments on this, it relates more to promise theory, maybe. I feel there's more compatibility with that, which I think is a good thing. And also highlights the modularity of OBOK in a way that maybe we can talk about more. I'm not sure
Yeah.
how, but yeah, I guess that's those
Yeah.
are my thoughts.
Yeah.
It was also a bit my thought, like it was relating to promise theory, because perhaps if we like really took the, let's say, if we teased out the agents and the scope and framed it only through the language of agents and promises and the implied boundaries or membranes of the scope, right, or of the kind of, yeah, well, I'm saying system, but it depends on the level of graining or granularity, right? Because from one perspective, it can be system, but if we zoom out or coarse grain, then it's an agent again, which is composed from different agents and promises. So anyway, so I was thinking, if we really took some like very small example, perhaps of the cafeteria, and teased out the agent and the offer, and the complementary perspective, kind of again describing the scope through the language of agents and promises. So I would be curious how that could look like, some like very minimal example where we could like say, oh, so this is the perspective of the super agent of the cafeteria. This is the perspective of the yeah, I don't know, the agent who is taking up on the offer.
Mhm.
And yeah, just thinking aloud here, because that's what Pablo said. It kind of opened up this can of promise worms. And yeah, since I'm not yet like skilled in applying the promise theory to such things, so that might be an interesting mini exercise, perhaps. Something like that.
Yeah, I agree with essentially both of you and how you put it. In terms of the promise theory, the one interesting possibility here is that if one thinks about it this way, so we start that like, okay, there's definition. Okay, I'm actually making something on the left side of the paradigms, just notes on what has been said, but uh, but I'll actually make another one here, which is trying to present something. So, okay, let's say we start with that there is definition, even just actually expression, which are kind of two ways of saying the same thing, as a kind of starting point. Like it's like almost like there is of any semantic space, and for me, economy or organization or games are built out of semantic space. So there is of semantic spaces that there is definition or expression. Like now, if we think then in a slightly unusual way that there is types of definition, and these two types. I know we have visited this topic earlier, but I'm kind of going into a new place with this, so bear with me. So there's two types of definition. There is actual and potential. And the actual being like this is in effect right now. Like this is the traditional definition style. Like if somebody's coding something, for example, what the code is, it's almost like everything in actual definition. Like I know that this is kind of simplifying things way too much, and it's almost like erroneous in a sense, because when the program runs, things are not necessarily on all the time, and then that's kind of like a that's very true. But we're kind of looking kind of one meta layer above that. But if we say had a system of definition that starts from the point that you can always define something in the type of the actuality, like that this is now actual code, and you can define in the sense of potentiality, is that this is actually not in effect right now, but then all the potentiality would come with almost like a wrapper that says what are the conditions of it becoming actual. So a right would be such a form, like, or it would at least contain some definition that is potential. Like it might, if we turn this into a practical, semi-practical example, is like what it could define actuality is that there is a particular scope, like let's say, let's pick the cafe, that there is this cafe, and it's an organization, but then and there is this, let's say, this person, this agent that could be, uh, uh, for example, you, or could be Jakub, or it could be me, or whatever. But then there would be this sort of definition of potential, which would be, so say, a right to get a cup of coffee, and that would be wrapped in you bringing, say, €3. that kind of approach to definition is interesting if it's taken to that level, because now you're dealing with relationality immediately. Like you're kind of bringing the relationality down to the lowest level if you have definition of the actual and the potential. And so this direction for me is interesting in terms of promise theory, because promise theory has this element, but it's a more high level concept, that there is these things and then there is promise. And then the promise is the one thing that creates potentiality in that system, or in that approach. But here actually everything can take form in terms of actuality is being in effect once it, like being in effect once it is present. That's, I guess, would be one way of saying actuality. And then there's potentiality, which is being potential once it's present, and then containing the conditions, or being wrapped with conditions that allow it to become actual. If I turn this to another example, which could be, say, board games. So what could be actual in a particular situation in a board game is like, there is this piece and there is this board and there are these directions to move, etc. That's all, like these elements that form it. But then the potential is the question of, like, you have the right to move here and you have the right to move here. Like, you, the player, can come and move this piece to this place and this place and this place. And it might also be that if you move it in this place, you have to pay 1 red token, if the board game have that kind of an element. So like what's happening here is, on the one hand, one could say it's very much like rights, is that the player has rights, like to make this move. And this one move comes with the condition of paying 1 red token. You could also say that what's happening here is an offer. It's the board is an offer, and it has these offers of move here freely, and you can also move here, but you have to pay 1 red token for it, and so on. Like it's doing both. Like both perspectives are fine, but in a way, like thinking of it as constantly mixing and interweaving from actual and potential is a more what's the like generally persistent or pervasive is the word I'm looking for. Pervasive way of maybe thinking about it. So, but then what comes with that, that all of these create relations, and they also create dynamic relations. And what I mean by this is, like, if I have a system that is only made of actualities in the terms I'm talking about now, it's like there's only that there is this piece and that piece and this piece and that piece, and there's no potential. Then the system is static, like in strict sense of terms, like that's a static system. Sure. But immediately when there is potential, like going back to this board game, that, okay, there is this piece on the board and then the board is like this and so on. But then there is this agent, the person who has the right or the potential to move this piece or here or here or here by their volition. Now it's a dynamic system because the system can change a state. But it's also a relation because now there is a defined channel or channels of relations between that agent that is the player and the board game. That the player can, they have see on their range of potential the relation of picking up the piece and moving it in place A, and picking up the piece and moving it in place B and place C, but with 1 red token. That is all relational. and this includes also like other system elements as well. Like if we think of that, here is an organization and here's another organization. They are systems in and of themselves, but this organization A has given the right for an organization B to make the move or make a proposal inside that organization, which is the same kind of relation as this sort of moving the piece in the board game. But now, if we think of this organization A and organization B, we see that this kind of definition works as relational definition, because that's a defined relation between those organizations that you have the right to propose, but it's also defining the potential in itself. Is this making sense? Or
Yes, definitely. I'm like some things that are revealing to me, like for example how if you have rules on a game and that's a scope and those rules changes, then there's a process of governance, right?
mm,
Or of decision making, and how generally games don't change the rules along the way. Of course, we have seen some examples here of some that do. So that shifting scope kind of, yeah, that is interesting to me, sort of like how things mutate in time.
mm,
And I'm making a diagram above where you are. Maybe we can explain some of this with that diagram. It's yeah, how to identify, how to dissect a specific element in these terms. So I'm
mm,
thinking of chess as an example. It
mm.
would be nice if we do it together, sort of
Yes.
having chess as an actionable scope, the rules of the game, having the board as the physical scope, having two players, and maybe move a pawn could be the uh, move we dissect. But I'm not sure. That's just a proposal. We can choose something else, maybe just to clear things.
Yeah, I'm maybe I'll move the text actually closer so I can see both at the same time, and others can see both at the same time, just to have this sort of practice. But yeah, like this is actually uh, true. But yeah, the one notion I wanted to add is that once we have dynamic relations, and we can see that these dynamic relations can create changes in systems, like moving a piece from place A to place B. We are not actually limited in terms of uh, whether the system as a whole, like the game of chess, can change or not. This is merely a design question after that. Like, because like, yes, it's a change in the system within the scope of the chess game of moving a piece, but nothing prevents this kind of principles to have a change in the system that changes some scope. It's merely limited by what actualities that system has set for itself, or actualities and potentialities. For example, if it has, to use a practical example again, so there is an organization that has these rules of like everybody who is a member has the potential of making proposals, and then there is this protocol of say majority vote, where every member has the potential of voting upon that, blah blah, that kind of direction. But if that organization also has a rule that you can make a proposal that changes the structure in itself, like how does this proposal making work, but say that needs a 75% or 90% yes vote for it, that's in the same range. Like the principles haven't really changed, even though that is a larger change in itself. Or if it says that it there is a right to make a proposal of joining two organizations or disbanding the organization, which is kind of violating the scope itself in a way. Um, um, that's actually not changing any of the basic principles that we are utilizing. So this kind of relates to your Ectogames link as well. Like in a way, like I think like games being designed as this sort of not just limited scopes but set scopes is more like a convention. There's reasons for that convention because it makes certain kind of designs easier and so on. But I think, by the way, the same reason as why many artworks are kind of limiting themselves to their own space, to have this sort of power to define that space in itself. But so if games have this convention of defining to a kind of an immutable scope or creating an immutable scope like a chess game, like that there are mutations within it, but the scope doesn't change. It's merely a convention. No principle really limits the fact that there could be something included in the game that makes it more distributed or networked as a structure. To make an example, if you would take the rules of chess, but you would say that it's actually chess betting. Let's call it that. And the game is actually that every one who is watching the game can bet on, say, the winning of the game or every move, which is of course something that even happens. You could say that that's a game in itself, like the chess plus the betting is now the game. But then if you think of that, that's actually much more open and distributed in terms of the structure. Like you don't know who the players are, and like somebody might walk in and make a bet or make a bet online. But once again, none of the principles of design and this sort of play with actual and potential hasn't not really changed at all. So with all of that, I'm saying like the games are actually not limited. The nature of games is not limited to kind of creating immutable scopes. It's more a convention that has created this sort of tradition of designing like that. But the possibility of designing structures that go out of themselves is always there. Like so, in this sense, like the article, what it's telling is, yeah, you can kind of make these two categories, but like and it's an interesting pathway. That's a whole other thing to talk about, but maybe I put it aside as a can of worms. Is what happens when games go outside of themselves and why they start behaving more like instruments. But it's because it's a little bit of a side branch. I'm maybe not opening that yet, at least. But with all of that, to kind of comprise from there, like if you have this pathway that we have definition expression, which is like there is for any kind of this semantic spaces, whether economic or organizational or game like to exist, is like a required condition. And then we have this sort of types of definition of actual and potential. And actually only with that, those inherently create relations as per the examples earlier. And those relations can be dynamic, that they can be dynamic to the system, that they can create system state changes, and they can potentially change anything depending on what actualities are set, because the actualities can set like a boundary, and the actual boundary is actually definition. Like the chess is defined in a manner that there is a kind of wrapping to it, a contouring to it, but there does not need to be such definition. And all of that kind of opens up this sort of sense of like rather than thinking rights, rather than thinking offers, actually thinking of actual potential inside a system, and rights and offers more like conventions based on that. But all of this is also at the same time towards creating relations inside the system itself. Sorry, that was a lot of things packed into together, but hopefully it makes sense as a thought.
Would you say that in for example in chess, the rules define the potential scope, whereas the turn, like the actual turn in which a player moves, defines maybe the actual scope? Or how would you draw that distinction between the two?
Uh, it's more kind of like it's almost like constant interplay between actual and potential. Like what's actual in the move is like there is a piece. The piece stands on this place of a board. These are all actualities. Like actualities are always in the sense of there is, but it's also there is a rule that these pieces can be moved by the player of white pieces on their turn. It is now white player's turn. White player is Pablo. All of these are actualities. And then potential is like it can move in this kind of pattern, which means that it can move here and here and here. But these are all in the form there could be. So whenever you meet there is, like there is this piece here in this place, that's all there is. That's actualities. Wherever there is, there could be, which is something that is not anything, but is within the kind of bounds of the rules, but is not yet. Like that this chess piece could be moved here. Then you have a potentiality.
I get it now. Would you say that actuality precedes potentiality necessarily, or not really?
Say again the last sentence you were cutting off.
If actuality has to precede potentiality, you need to have first actuality for something to be potential, like the rule has to exist for it to create the potential.
Roughly speaking, yes. Like generally, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the first thing is that you have the potential to have a rule, so egg and chicken problem, but more or less that's the idea, no?
Yeah. Like in a way, like I think it's maybe good to just cut it and say yes, because it's kind of opening this sort of rabbit hole to question that. I think it makes it clearer to say yes, that you have to have actualities to create potentialities. Jakob?
Yeah, so for me, it also, again opens up kind of another. I'm sorry, I was just ordering stuff.
Oh, you're in
beer.
a cafe.
Yep, and I think now the beer time is coming.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
what was
actuality of
like, yeah, but what was kind of again this unarticulated thought, but when we are speaking about let's say the possible moves and the actualities and the potentialities, and yeah, we can stay with the image of the chessboard or with this kind of scope or situation. Then what occurs to me is that when like using the language of potential and potentialities, it kind of again kind of some intuitive or underlying conceptual metaphor for me is there's some like energy or electromagnetism, like electromagnetic field like relations, which from one perspective can be like when I imagine an let's say the kind of a scape of affordances which is being shaped by let's say the rules which kind of reshape the scape of what is possible or what is doable, like kind of defining some kind of energetical thresholds which can be in a given conditions, under given conditions, they can be they define what is possible, right? So this thingy can jump there because the threshold of the energy to be crossed is low, or even there is some kind of pull or whatever. Yes. So why I'm saying all those like bits and pieces is that for me this kind of could imply this kind of like physicalist or even like statistical physics or whatever kind of bunch of metaphors that might be there. And yeah, so I was just wondering, when I say those random thoughts, what's your thoughts?
No, I think it's going somewhere interesting in itself. Like, yeah, I don't know what to call it either. Like also potentialist physics. I don't know. Like, but yeah, like I do see kind of the direction you're putting it. Like one of the reasons I also raised this, like I think this can work in every context, but especially when we are talking about things like games or things like organizations, which includes economies in all forms. Actually designing them is that the design is precisely this sort of intertwining of the actual and the potential. Like you have to design the potential like inside the game or an organization or an economy in itself. Like that's where the kind of dynamicness of the scope comes. But the actuality is also what sets the the pieces to be moved, that there is something there for the dynamics to play with, so to speak. So I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it, and I wanted to kind of raise it because it kind of like what I find is quite interesting and quite potential is how it kind of nests within it immediately. Once you have that, you are bound to create relations because the potential means relations. You're bound to create dynamic relations, like once again the examples earlier, and then you're also bound to kind of create like these high level structures like rights or offers uh, also in it. So in a way, like it's almost like this sort of seed or recursive packaging, this way of starting from definition, but then putting the definition into two modes. I think actually I'll put modes then rather than types. I think it's modes. Uh, in these two modes, and suddenly everything is kind of entailed in that. The inherent relationality, the dynamicness of the system, etc. So all of that is kind of like yes, it's a kind of a can of worms, but it's an interesting can of worms. But I do think it's under this concept of rights, and on the other hand, the concept of offers as well is this can of worms. It's another question how much it needs to be opened. I do think it's useful to be informed by it, but I don't know. What do you think about this? Like, in a way, like when one talks about this sort of key structures, like, oh, everything is kind of functioning as rights, or like my ability to propose in an organization or vote in an organization, or to withdraw money from a bank, it's kind of like a right, but from the bank side, it's an offer. So these are key structures. But then underneath them, they're like, look at that, there is actually a conjoining, almost like a very simple fractal element where this can grow. That is interesting, but it's another thing what to do with that kind of knowledge.
I guess I'm perhaps still stuck a bit with the thought or this image of when again staying with the chess pieces, and then I'm staying a bit still with kind of the affordance metaphor, which is that after some kind of negotiation, either with let's say the concept or the game itself and the other player, then I'm kind of voluntarily shaping my scape of affordances and accepting that this is the moves that will be happening. in relation to the physical representation, right, of the board. So I will be moving the pieces here and here, and I don't even think of other possibilities. I voluntarily forget those. I just like don't, they do not exist, and therefore do not like make noisy do not bring noise into my decision making. So I'm accepting the constraints. And so I was thinking like what is preceding this is because I could still like do those moves, right? They're somehow implied. I can just take the thing and just like jump whenever I want. But then this is the kind of consequences or possible, let's say, the risks and costs that are kind of helping define or I'm exploring this metaphor, so please bear with me. It's not
it's fine.
not much defined, but it's kind of in a sense that there is conditions that like are preceding or helping define the process of me kind of accepting this game frame, and part of it is some like I mean, if I would just like running around the chessboard, then there could be some negative social consequences, right? Some costs or risks. And this assessment kind of is a part of how I then accept to I don't know, embody or enact the affordandscape. But anyway, so this is just like very disjointed thought, free associations, right? But I guess it's kind of bringing in just like what is preceding the creation of those potentialities and actualities in my cognitive system, or in our like social cognitive system that we are creating above the game with the game.
Yeah, I think it's actually a sensible direction. Like if I talk through it like on two layers, like I go first higher layer, like correct me if I'm wrong, or but I put my version of it. Like if there exists a game, say chess, like it's on the table somewhere. One way to think about it now, the higher level, is like the game is an offer in itself. What's the offer? Well, the offer is you can become a player if you have another player. I'm now thinking just an analog chess, like to make it simple. So, so it's offering you to become a player. The condition is to find another player. If you accept this offer, you gain certain rights in the scope of the chess game, which is like, let's say you decided or became the white player, you have immediately the right to move one white piece. And there's a bunch of rules, bunch of actualities that set that in itself, but you have this potential of moving one piece. So that's one, like in a way, the game is an offer in itself. And and it kind of reflects this to go to touch upon the earlier topic of how rule-like structures, which is really here also definitions, are always both constraining and enabling. Is that if you kind of take upon this offer and restrain yourself to actually follow the rules of the chess, you are enabled to get these rights in the scope of the chess game. So the same thing here. But then in terms of like if we go level down and think about it as actualities and potentialities, it's like it isn't the same thing in slightly different terms. It's like okay, the chess game is designed with this actualities that are set, and then potentialities that relate to these actualities, and then like you can come one of these actualities, which is then filling a slot of a player, and then you gain all these potentialities, and but that's a perspective towards the chess game's design in itself. And of course, it's completely valid to think about this through a concept of affordances. It's a kind of on the similar ground with a slightly different perspective, but it's kind of covering the same basis. That in a way, like the chess is an offer, and once you restrict yourself or abide by the chess rules, you gain the affordances in the scope of the chess. what creates that scope, it's the actualities of the chess and also the potentialities in itself, but that creates that scope in itself. But we can go through the same thing for an organization or a economy or an action in a particular economy in itself, like you withdrawing from your bank account, like some of the cases in the bank account, the rules are enforced by the system in like, for example, that simply a different move is not available, whereas in analog chess, like you're doing self-enforcing or player enforcing that, but it's kind of the same thing. It's just like, in a way, that's almost like a higher order thing, this sort of enforcement. How does the enforcement happen? But ultimately, the system is very similar. Like also the bank follows this actualities and potentialities. Like there is an actuality that you have an X amount in your account, and there is an actuality that of the login or whatever, and then you have the potentiality of withdrawing, which makes it once again a dynamic system again, or transferring. But then when you're transferring, you have to follow the actualities of the filling in the bank account where you're moving it, and so on and so forth. And if you follow those actualities, the potentiality of moving it opens. So yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a deep dive, but it also, like said earlier, like if you compare this to promise theory, this is like, now it's pervasive. Now, like whatever this quality of the potential, it's potentially anywhere in any size. Like it can be very small, very large. It's expressive potential rather than a category of expression. Yeah. Yeah, like I said, it's a bit of a deep dive, but what it points to me is like maybe like it's useful to think in the background, whatever one does is like when one thinks about rights, and whenever one thinks about offers, like then there is a way to kind of go one level deeper and see how they unite, but also that then kind of expands up to, for example, roles, because roles are essentially, I mean, they can be other things, but they are generally like the spaces of rights, as said earlier. Like now we could say, once again, they are packages of actualities and potentialities, like in and of themselves. But they take this sort of particular place in the system of interfacing with agents. Uh, uh, and and yeah, like, so for me that that is a direction of like potential recrystallization in the manner of like looking at all these forms as more like conventions, like the offers and rights and roles, and being aware of the sort of what's underneath, because that might open up actually other packagings. And this is not to say that these kind of more formed conventions of utilizing actual and potential are not useful. They are, um, because they probably serve a purpose and give a kind of easier way of thinking about the system. They're like shorthands. Uh, but yeah, like I, but that's one area that I'm being uh, shedding some, or maybe it's better to say mind more deeply into. I'm also digesting Pablo your diagram.
Diagram might need a little bit of help, especially with the move part of it. But I mean, some interesting things about the diagram. You have the players who exist, like a part of them exists within, outside the scope of the game. Like you can always flip the board in anger, right? I guess you would lose automatically, so maybe you're not out of the game, but that feels a bit out of the game. Then you have the turn, which is part of the rules, but also affects the physical scope of the board itself. So I believe it's between the two. And yeah, the move part needs a bit more work. But what I was thinking about right now, or an interesting image that came to my head in terms of actuality and potentiality, when you have a software chess, like a game, a chess in a computer game situation, and you hover on some pieces, sometimes it tells you where you can move it, right? Like the potential of the places where you are able to move it to.
Yeah, the
Uh,
highlights. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. I was thinking if we would play like a quantum chess where you can have each move perform all of its potential moves once you select it, maybe you could have like this higher dimensional space where yeah, chess develops in terms of their potential place. So just thinking of quantum physics, and as Jacob said, sort of um, probabilistic math, and how this potentiality can be described in that way, and actuality then becomes like potentiality becomes actuality, just as yeah, superposition particles become defined when you look at them, and these kinds of situations. So maybe that's also an interesting filter, I guess, to think of
Yeah.
the relationship between actuality and potentiality.
Yeah, actually it is, because in a way, if you start to approach systems in this manner, then these things like superposition, etc., almost become the expected behavior. That's a long can of worms. But this is also when I've been reading Burgess, or guess, however you pronounce that, like, and he's having these reflections towards the quantum physics and physics in general, but also thinking kind of these kind of perspectives, which it's kind of reflects that. So, for example, Pablo, your case of like if you would see the moves of the piece like unfurling in this potential further, like you can think of the chess game almost like the sort of like a packed seed, or like an algorithm of a fractal, or that has this always this potential to unfurl. But when it unfurls, it makes actual some of the potential, like puts a certain number in a fractal, then it unfurls in a certain way. Um, and then, um, like, well, fractals usually just continue unfurling. So there's only potential maybe to add the one number, and then that just creates that. But inside a game, this is more like alternating thing that you actualize one potential, the system unfurls into a new state, and then you actualize another potential, and then it unfurls to a yet another state. But all of that is kind of contained within the chess, like in this sort of recursed package kind of way. But that, in the sense of that the system is this intertwining of actual and potential, makes complete sense. That's how it is to be. Like this existence as like a huge number of potential states is like a natural quality of such things. There was another notion here, but I forget it now. Um, maybe I'll remember it later. But and in some ways, like this, for let's say many operations, is probably too nitty gritty. But on the other hand, like understanding when you're working on a higher level, I think this might be useful, like just as a way of thinking about things, uh, um, like it's very much going into the nuts and bolts of 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 organizations, games, economies, etc., and the kind of this sort of human systems, semantic systems, call them whatever, that we create. Um, And yeah, like, but then on a kind of I think one practical higher level point that comes from there is that I would potentially rethink this sort of offer and write, not necessarily that one has to get rid of them, also write and move, etc. It's not about getting rid of them, but more maybe understanding of their Lego blocks, what kind of Lego blocks make them. Oh yeah, I remember the point. I'll bring it still, even though it's still dipping into this deep dive, but because it's interesting. So in terms of relations, like if you think of the relations of chess pieces on a chessboard in a particular state of a chess game, now, of course, we think like, oh yeah, that's very much a relation. The relation between these pieces is the game, or is the kind of situation of the game that is currently at hand. But if you think, is it a better picture to think about those relations between the pieces in terms of their actual and potential? I would say yes, very much so, because that's actually a much more accurate picture of what is the actual relations, like this compared to, say, the spatial relations. I mean, we as people work through interpreting the sense of the spatial relations of the pieces. But to be a good chess player, we actually see beyond that, and we see towards the potentials of the pieces and the in relation to the actualities, and are able to read that kind of network further, and that actually makes us better chess players, because it's a much more, in a way, purer map of the real relations between those pieces. That the real relations between the chess pieces are actually consisting from these potentials and their actualizations and the cascades that they form. That's the actual effective relational space of them, which is interesting, I think. But but that was a bit of a deep dive. But any impressions of what one could do with this let's say, a layer of understanding?
I would personally like to see the OBOK elements dissected with this understanding. To sort of like, okay, what is a move in this with this understanding? What remain, like what OBOK elements will remain and how we define them? I think that would be useful to then utilize them.
Yeah, I actually kind of started that after coming up with this a couple of days ago. Like move is very close to rights, like a right in its nature. That it's more like it's very much about defining potential in itself, and it's also very much kind of this sort of agent-oriented definition. Like, okay, it's an interface between agent and the system, and the interface consists of this sort of potentials that it can utilize under certain conditions, which are the actual also made. The conditions are made out of the actualities. But so those are very close. But then there are a couple of other things. Like I was visiting Scene, and this is still sketchy, but for me, like the scene in itself is like one relation. If one visits this first metaphorically, is like I can think of the scene as almost like a game board. That it's a sort of it's a it is a system in one way, like a scene. It's a maybe it's a small system, but it's a system nonetheless. It sets certain actualities, and it sets potentialities potentially between them, but it also usually allows the entrance of other system elements in it, like for example, a person with certain kind of rights, for example, could walk into that scene, and that might change the scene in itself. And this is why I think it's the game board metaphor is sort of useful for it, I think. But so in a way, like it's this sort of system element that is usually or tends to be allowing other system elements to enter into it and change the nature of the scene in itself, like, which is interesting. Like it's like I would put like if one takes a chessboard, that's kind of very rigidly defined, and you can enter it, but it's very much controlled. There is no like there's no new player that could come in. Whereas in a scene, in conventionally so, say it's a scene of that is designed for a certain kind of meeting, but it might not know whether there is only members or also a mix of members and I don't know, like administrators, and it has to work with that. Like it can have like a variety of different potentialities and agents with different potentialities coming into the scene, and usually scenes are defined to be tolerant of that. Does that make sense? Maybe not. If I make a practical example, so there is a scene of a cafe. It's a designed cafe, but unlike the chess, which has predefined the players in the scene, in the chess, in the cafe there is a kind of customer role, but there might be a situation where a manager walks in and the manager is doing things there and asking about the inventory while the customers are there. But there's also a situation there is no manager. Or then if there is like super club members for the cafe, there might be a situation that there are super club members and just normal customers, or just super club members, or just customers, etc. So there is a kind of like dynamicness that it's more open to roles. It might know about this, but it's like in chess you always know it's the black player and these are its potentialities, and it's the white player and these are its potentialities. So this is very much kind of in the design convention that scene is designing something like a board, but it's a little bit more flexible and like tolerant to various dynamics that could come into it. Hopefully the example helped somewhat.
I guess you're referring to the rigidity of rules and sort of like how rigid a rule is defines potentiality.
Yeah, and actuality as well, like how it sets those. Yeah, like, and I think that goes more towards, like I said, like it's more like a convention. It's not like a hard line, like because you can design something like it's a continuum. Like you could create them very rigid, little bit rigid, more flexible, etc. Like all of that is possible in itself. But also like just as an example, like if we think of the earlier last week's kind of playtest. So in a way, like the original rules, the perspectives and saying like select one perspective, play it and define it like with one sentence. Well, that's setting potentiality. It's actuality of definition of these other rules, but what those do is that they set this sort of potential. And then everyone has this potential of making these moves. But once you make the move, so like say somebody played down infrastructure, a gallery for showing multiple visual images, then that move created an actuality now. Now the board is not empty anymore. There is the infrastructure move played, but the potential is still there for everyone to make a move. Another move is played, I think next was the Pursuit, Poetic Dreams, and then that becomes an actuality. And now the actuality of the board has changed, but the potential of making new moves stays similar in terms of the affordances of it, but it's playing with a different kind of board in itself. Now, of course, like one can go from there and say, like, of course, like there's always conversation around that, and that is kind of like meta play in itself, which is meta play that affects the play. But it's also interesting to see the system part of this, because it allows to, you know, think about the design itself. So like we can see this potentiality actuality playing here, or in the earlier case as well. And then if one thinks about the scene that was set there, like what that scene definition, these bullet points, it's kind of throwing in actualities. It's like creating a new board, which then can be entered, and that board can have this sort of conditions, like it's describing the hairstyles as protoshapes, then a certain kind of play style, a goal, like a question. But that's kind of like setting up a scene, but it's also one can see it as very much like board-like in its behavior. So that is just an example of how these qualities are also present in, as would be expected, they are present, but they are present in like any of the forms that we're utilizing, or any of the plays that we have made.
Maybe this is a request for a future session, or to do it asynchronously, but I would like to see, maybe again going back to my diagrams, a sort of like layered diagram of the most basic components and how things built upon those relating to OBOK. And I know that a hierarchical model is not always the best, so maybe we can use this as one perspective and then do another perspective, organize OBOK elements in a different way. But maybe, yeah, having like these definitions of OBOK through different perspectives could be an interesting way of defining it multi-perspectively. So that is, yeah, I guess I would like to do that.
Yeah, and I think it would be useful also in the sense of understanding this, like, and in the sense of being able to go to the nuts and bolts level, but also operating on the high level as well. Actually, one example that I was meaning to mention, which was the exhibited by the image for the Telegram message, which was that I took this sort of screen capture from the couple of elements from your hair drawings and just call it the wave gene 01. So it was actually kind of came from these kind of thoughts, because I thought, like, okay, what kind of makes the gem element? Like, for example, the kind of gems we were playing, there were certain rules, i.e. actualities and potentialities set. Like there is this potential of adding a definition in a category, and then when they are set, they become actualized in there, and they become part of the the board or itself. But then the potential of making new definitions into that is already there. But it's very much kind of moving in the same actualities, potentiality space. And what I thought about, like, really the heart of the gene then is the rules that you set upon them, to put it in a very, like, blunt, short fashion. So if I can see that there could be rules for the wave gene, which is like, oh, you take any image and say you start tracing from it shapes. And maybe there's more to those rules, but that's a starting point. Well, that's the gene. And then let's call that the wave gene. Maybe there's another name. Maybe it's a trace gene. I don't know. But then by that sense, because I was actually just codifying rules from what you were doing, and not that you were following those rules, you were just doing what you were doing, but I was kind of codifying that. But then that just codifying those rules creates a new gene, because then you can always take that behavior and that creates a new image, therefore a new gene in and of itself. And then the playing is actually the creation of those in itself. Of course, you could add other rules, like to make it playable for the viewer as well, like name the shapes, or for example, unlike. But it's a good example of the flexibility this kind of viewpoint can open. That suddenly you can start to see this different gene forms maybe more readily or more easily when you have when you look at things this way. Or have I lost you on the gene?
I'm here. I just don't want to speak more. Maybe Jacob wants to say something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, sorry, I was just sitting in the cafeteria, just doing some logistics here, so I wasn't present in the last few seconds or minutes.
Yes, no problem dealing with actualities. But yeah, I think, like, I know there was always a danger that this turns into a bit of a deep dive, and now that, like, it's you two, I think the danger was even larger. So I guess I'm blaming you for going this deep. No, I'm not. But I do think, like, I really think, like, um, so while it's not quite there, what it's offering to me is like this. There's a certain kind of flexibility that is offered towards the sort of forms like scenes or rights, because they are not anymore this sort of holding points that this is the concept that should be, or the correct concept, etc. But it's rather like, oh, okay, there's this sort of like really nuts and bolts level formations, but then you want to put the shorthands sometimes to put easier formations, but there could be many of them. But on the other hand, you sometimes only want to utilize one of them or other of them to create a certain kind of design direction. Like sometimes you might want to use rights, or sometimes you want to use moves, and that's simply a choice towards maybe like emphasizing certain aspects of it. But you're can look at those concepts, the rights and moves, as quite flexible, because they are more higher level synthetics out of more lower level forms, so to speak.
What becomes really interesting to me in this perspective is just sort of how, especially talking in the crypto realm, where things become very interoperable at a level. I mean, I'm thinking holochain right now, like at a very cheap level, for example, like you can formalize these rules in a distributed way very easily. How the distinction between a game and an organization is determined just by culture and scope of the activities and tone, but in reality, in terms of how the things might be coded, it's not really that different, right? So
Yeah.
these filters, these perspectives become really fundamental in shaping, yeah, how something. Why? What do I think of something? How do I conceive something as an organization or a game?
Mhm.
Just how, yeah, how that is presented, basically.
Yeah, and it allows this sort of like the flexibility opens up like interesting possibilities. So, for example, let's think of this images of this hair images, for example, that in a way they are actualities, and they they actually like when they were played, they probably offered kind of fairly undefined or loosely defined potentialities, which is okay. Like definition can also be loose. It doesn't have to be strict like to the level of a number. It can also be like it would be a definition of you can do anything with that. This like so, and that's defining potentiality in a loose but still functioning manner. But I mean, there was a little bit more. There was this whole scene that was informing this, uh, how the pictures were used. But ultimately, these pictures set up as actualities, and then one started generating from them, uh, uh, like from like using this sort of loose potential other actualities upon them, which kind of opens up this sort of possibility of thinking uh, even organizations in the same manner, like how a certain document or even a certain comment can be an actuality. Then you can think of, okay, what are the kind of potentialities or use Jacob concepts affordances around it? What, which of them are coded? Are there other affordances that are more loosely coded around it? What if I utilize those potentialities and do something with it, like uh, like say with if it's an organizational document, I make a variant of it and say it's a new branch of the organization and offer it as such. What can be done with those kind of directions? Yeah, there is this sort of like very still drafty but still present flexibility there, which I find interesting. Um, and maybe it would have made sense for me to work like a week more to be a little bit more solid with these things, uh, or more farther along. But I do think like uh, that it's interesting to open up this sort of possibilities to for you to think about as well.
I'm thinking of how. Go ahead, Paco.
No, I was just saying it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking of how, with the example of the hair, right? That I just like drew this, and that became an actuality. But
Mhm,
then the action, if you generalize it, sort of like uh, extracting, defining features of a hairstyle,
mhm,
that becomes a potentiality, right? You have the potential of doing it for how as many hairstyles as you want, and that sort of like generalization process
mhm,
of turning actualities into potentialities
mhm,
is sort of very interesting, especially for those actualities that didn't necessarily come from a potentiality, right? Because at that moment we didn't know this was a thing, and I just drew on top of the hair, and then these two these two layers emerge: the actuality of the drawing and the potentiality of repeating the process. So yeah, I'm just thinking of extracting these actions into actionable components. Yeah, I don't know, I guess
No,
I'm repeating myself all over again.
no. That's I think that is actually a really interesting area. That's like like so okay. If everything starts from expression or definition, this is kind of what's happening here. Like you're expressing it. Yeah, you might be expressing it by drawing, but you might also express it to give that potentially to others in terms of, hey, you can do this. And it is this sort of, once again, this mix that every potentiality is like an actuality that could happen. So you define an actuality, but you put it in the form that it could be. It's not here yet, in a way. But then that, like, let's say you to create it as a potentially, you kind of create it as a rule, say a move, that there is now this move that is like tracing this hair or taking any shape, taking any image and start tracing shapes from it. And now it becomes a move. But also in here, there comes these nuances of how, when something could be, how could it be? Like if you say, this is a move that is available for everyone, versus if you say, this is the only move you can do, those are both potentialities, but they're different in quality because it's the conditions of getting to the potential are different, and that then becomes a nuance in and of itself. Like okay, I found this potential. I want to give it as a potential. What kind of conditions I put upon it to create different kind of situations through that, and then it in itself then generates actualities when people are drawing these things, which then become part of the situation itself or the scene, really, like one can think of here, uh, uh, which then kind of feed that you still have the potential, but it's being kind of informed or it's interplaying with the actualities that are there, the other drawings, etc. Like, yeah, it's kind of like ability to see the game happening or play happening in a, and also play being expressed, like what you were describing. Once you start thinking about it, like packaging it into a move, thinking about actually what is the conditions that open that move, and thinking that the move is committed or executed, and then that creating actualities and how it changes the scene that we are playing and how the scene then affects the further moves. Like all of that is this sort of like one level zoom into the play in a way. Like that you're one level closer to see how the play happens from quote unquote normal way of thinking about these things.
And what becomes very interesting about that is the implicit notion when talking about actuality and potentiality, the implicit notion of time. Like there has to be a progression of time for this loop to continue proliferating. That's sort of like very obvious when talking about games. Like if I want to show you a game, the best way is to show you how it develops through time. And I'm thinking we don't do that with organizations, right? It's
Yeah,
like, check out this organization, and it's just like a static picture of what in reality is like an ongoing process of, yeah,
yeah,
it's like showing a still frame of a movie and
yeah,
calling it a movie. It's
yeah,
ridiculous.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the same depth exists in these organizations, like exactly the same depth. It's not at all less deep than this gameplay. It's just that maybe like approaching it through games and then analyzing them together brings precisely these sort of possibilities of seeing these deeper possibilities, but also like also creating possibilities of creation and generation, like as a direction. So I'm so I'll promise to kind of work on these directions. I think they're kind of reorganizing, like keeping the concepts, but they're putting them in an interesting place. Like for example, the scene and how to think about the actualities, adding as in a way updating the scene in a way. But that, I think scene is still a kind of a fertile concept in that case as well. And so I don't think like the structures that we're thinking are going away. Like it's just that there is a way to think about them differently and maybe kind of then adjust maybe their palette of how they form. But I think it can open up this sort of like at least this sort of zooming mechanism that you can create an organization game economy on this higher level. That's fine, or that's an approach that can work. But if you want to, you can also dive down and go to, okay, let's analyze here, like what are the actualities here, what is here in terms of the things that we are kind of undeniable in a way, and what is in the form of could, that it kind of exists. It has even a definition to it, but it's not here yet. But it's a possibility. And then what is the tracing, the root that could can turn to yes, like conditions, moves, maybe multiple moves, etc. And that in itself creates a really interesting way of exploring this sort of deep level. And you can go to that level if you want, but you don't need to. You can work on a higher level as well. So yeah, but then like beyond that, I think like as an example, this wave gene, it's already kind of creating this new thoughts about the genes as well. That's a side product from this. That wave gene was a snapshot of that, but that's a possibility. But yeah, it's I think probably enough for a session. It's been a long session. Thanks for bearing through it, and it's also been a rather deep diving session. So I think it's good to give a bit of a rest for these thoughts as well. But yeah, I think this is promising. It's based also on this hunch that many of these structures that I thought first go through this sort of like very much kind of deep dive and reorganizing, and then they kind of solidify from there. And I do think that this is offering this sort of potential recrystallization of things, but hopefully it creates some thoughts from each of your side as well in the coming days. But I'll promise to work on that regardless.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Any last thoughts?
A lot to process. So, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to how this crystallizes further and congeals together with the other parts or aspects.
Yeah, but it's also like earlier mentioned, the promise theory. It's like this is the kind of like tapping a bit deeper that I think the promise theory also means. Like it can function by itself, but also I think the deeper understanding is useful, and it can feed on that as well. But yeah, I'll first of all stop sharing. That's the ritual, and I will then. I don't think I have any last thoughts beyond this. Just let's return on this, and I'll try to be returning on the document level before next session with some further thoughts of how the solidification could happen.
Nice.
Yeah.
Looking forward.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.